What's up, everyone? If I were to make a list of the top 20 questions I get asked, let's say twice a year, definitely in the top 10 would be, how do I get started as an out of state investor? Markets near me aren't that good. Should I just wait for markets near me to get better? I feel like it's a twofold question, but I'm going to make it one. And I've gotten this so often, but I've never truly addressed it on this podcast. So I figured, why not finally do it? I feel like out of state investing has gotten so much easier. It's something that even 10 years ago, 7 years ago, I think would have been fairly difficult. But nowadays, with technology, the interconnectedness, the internet, everything like that, I think a lot of the questions about whether you can do it, should you do it, have really been answered with yes, as long as XYZ. So let's get into what exactly the XYZ is that you need in place to be an out-of-state investor.
Building a real estate portfolio is as much about buying properties as being a de facto entrepreneur. I'm Karina Ufinger. I'm a multi-property investor, rental management company CEO, and also a landlord coach. I'm going to show you the systems and knowledge you need to thrive as a real estate entrepreneur. From your first property purchase to building a portfolio of passive income where you work less than 5 hours a week, you'll learn the essential information and skills to build a profitable portfolio and live the life you truly want. Whether you're well on your journey or just starting out, you're in the right place. Welcome to the Landlord Chick podcast.
So if we're going in kind of a logical order with what it means to be an out-of-state investor, one of the first areas we got to think about is financing. Now, yes, if you are going to be an out-of-state investor, if you don't physically live in the state that you're going to be investing in, it will be a little trickier finding a lender. Now, not necessarily trickier in the sense of it's going to be harder to find them, but I'll tell you from what I recommend people to, I tend to tell people to go to local banks. So your local banks, your local credit unions. Those are also the same institutions that tend to have rules about not working with out-of-state investors or out-of-country investors. They might even have rules about the proximity to the property and a branch location, so on and so forth. So financing is one of the first things that you definitely want to figure out because you're not going to have quite as many options as, say, someone who is buying in Oregon and they live in Oregon. So you want to be sure and start doing the footwork on finding a lender early. Now, you can still ask, obviously, regional or local banks and credit unions. It never hurts to ask, but be prepared for no's in that aspect because it's probable that they have some sort of rule in place like that. What you may need to find yourself doing is go to one of the larger banks, the ones I always talk about in very et cetera ways. So Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, or you go with some sort of reputable online mortgage company. But a lot of this, including the financing, is going to come down to networking. And that's really what the biggest part of being an out-of-state investor is. It's your networking. So this is a good transition into, I guess, the next portion of it, which is stepping up your online networking game. If you live in Maine and you are planning on buying property in Iowa because you view it's an opportunity market, one of the first things I want you to do is I want you to start joining Iowa Facebook groups for real estate. So whether it be Des Moines specific or Dubuque specific or just Iowa in general, even if it's not, so let's say you want to invest in Cedar Rapids, but there's no Cedar Rapids group. But maybe there's an Ames group or there's a Des Moines group. Go ahead and join that group, even though they might be kind of far away from where you're looking to invest, because you never know who knows who. And basically the purpose of joining these groups is to start accessing other people's networks, getting their referrals for people that they use. And you never know who they know in Iowa or who they might know that can help you out wherever you're looking to invest. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to start joining these local Facebook groups. Also, if you don't already have one, I'll say this, I think, for like the third time in like the past 6 weeks on this podcast episode. Join Bigger Pockets. I feel like most of you here are Bigger Pockets members because you found me on Bigger Pockets. You've messaged me and been like, hey, love the podcast. So I feel like most of you are, but just in case you're not, also join Bigger Pockets. Doesn't cost anything. I'm not here to promote them, but it is a very, very good resource. So after you've found a couple networking groups on Facebook that you're going to join online and you've started to look into financing, the next thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to get a reputable realtor. This is, again, something you're going to go to those Facebook groups for. This is why I recommend joining those Facebook groups pretty early on, because they can take away a lot of the headaches as you start to build your network. And also, they're going to give you referrals of people that you've used. I've talked about this previously, that when you go into a Facebook group and ask for recommendations, what I highly recommend you do is make sure and put in there that you aren't looking for self-promotion. You want the contacts that other investors have used, that they've had positive experiences with. So you're going to use your Facebook group that you found and you've joined, and you're going to ask for references on realtors. Now, hopefully you're going to get some recommendations for realtors who are investor friendly, even investors themselves. One of the things that you're going to want to do is do your own general research, obviously, on the market, which at this point, hopefully you have. But you want to be able to understand some of the lingo that the agent might be talking to you about. So if they're talking about specific neighborhoods, so I look over at Milwaukee here because that's the place that I know with neighborhoods. There's like six, 7 different neighborhoods I can name off the top of my head. So there's Brady Street neighborhood, there's Walker's Point, and that's just the two that always come to mind first. But you want to be sure and understand the lingo. So know the lingo as far as the neighborhoods, if that comes into play with where you're looking to invest. Be sure that you can communicate with the realtor effectively. You want to interview the realtor. You want to make sure it's a person that you could see yourself having a drink with occasionally. That's sort of the marker as far as understanding if you get along with your realtor or not. It is really important to get along with your realtor, especially when you're an investor, if you're going to make more than one transaction, because you don't want to hook up with one, find out you don't get along, and then for your second one, have to find a whole nother realtor or over again. So that's why I recommend finding one that you feel like you could have a beer with in the event you were to ever meet in person. So you're going to interview your realtor, you're going to get signed up with them, you're going to go through the hooplas, you're going to listen to their speech. They're going to get you set up on an MLS search. Then you also want to be sure and find a realtor who will be willing to look at off-market listings. Realtors looking at off-market listings does not necessarily happen as often as you think. There's a lot of realtors out there that sort of go the lazy route. They set up an MLS search and they think it's like a Ronco food dehydrator. You set it and you forget it. I don't like that approach to it, especially because I think that if you get a realtor who is entrenched in investing, then they should have access to off-market deals, whether it be wholesalers or people sort of going to them and being like, hey, I'm thinking about selling. Do you know anybody? Or just being active in the community. So find yourself a realtor that is willing to look at off-market deals and approach off-market sellers. So you've got your realtor, you've got your Facebook group, you've got your financing, you likely know where you're going to go for it. Maybe you haven't applied yet because, you know, your approval is only going to be good for about 60 days on average. What you're going to do is you're going to start building out the rest of your network. So if we look at your network, what you need yet is you're going to need a property manager. Whether or not you like to admit it, if you're going to be investing out of state, you definitely need a property manager. Now, if you don't have a property manager, but you have a friend or a cousin or someone that happens to live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where you're going to invest, I'm not saying that you can't use them, but if you do choose to use them with caution, because the weight then of knowing how all the state procedures work falls on you, rather than if you had a property manager and you were going to hire one. I think I've done a podcast or two about hiring a property manager. You interview them, you kind of quiz them generally to see what depth of knowledge they have on the local real estate laws. But you're not required to necessarily know everything to the full extent because, well, that's what you're hiring the property manager for. If you're not hiring a property manager and you're using a cousin or a friend, then be prepared that that weight of knowledge will be placed on you. You have to know what the guidelines are for the security deposit return. You have to know what the guidelines are for protected classes in that state, in that county. You need to know what the rules say about applications. You need to know all of these things rather than having someone else out there who's knowledgeable and is entrenched in that actual law. Now, you found your property manager, you got your realtor. We still have a little bit of the puzzle piece missing, and this is going to be contractors. One thing that is changing across the country in regards to the labor shortage is that on-staff maintenance is becoming less and less common. It used to be very common, especially in the 90s, that property management companies would have on-staff maintenance teams. That would be technicians that would go and fix things. They would go and fix leaky pipes, broken doors, etc. It kind of got hard to staff maintenance teams right around like 2010, 2011, but it's really gotten increasingly hard. So we're having this conversation about networks and contractors because if you are someone who's doing a BRRRR, the contractor that you pick for that BRRRR is probably going to be one of the biggest determining factors in its success. So getting connections with good, reliable contractors outside of your property manager's network is really critical. Now, it doesn't matter if there's overlap. So let's say the same 3 that your property manager recommends are the same 3 that you find going through Facebook groups in Iowa. That's totally fine. But it's just the fact that you've established it independent of the property manager's opinion and you build a connection with them on your own. So you want to get your contractors, you want to get your GC, you want to get a painter, a plumber, HVAC, and electrician. Now, it's very possible you could find some of these wrapped into one. So it's not uncommon to find a general contractor who can do a lot of plumbing for you and obviously painting. But it's less common to find a GC that will go into the depths of electrical just based on the knowledge needed and the permits. And certainly HVAC is on the similar wavelength as electrician. So you'll want to get those situated and get those in your realm of contractors. Now, the reason we're doing that is because if you do hire a property manager, but you're doing a BRRRR, most property managers will not actually hire and retain HVAC company or anyone for you until you actually have signed a property management contract and the property is ready to be rented. That's an important thing to remember. As an out-of-state BRRRR investor, you may find it that property managers will not actually sign a management contract for that property until it is market ready. The reason for that is if they're not going to control the contractors going in there, they don't necessarily want to be a part of what's going on beforehand. So it's really important to understand with a BRRRR, you're going to probably need a general contractor who will also kind of serve as your project manager, unless you can find a project manager local who does those things without actually being the GC. Not extremely common, but not rare. But that's just something to keep in mind. Now we've got your network built out. The next thing you need to consider is where you're going to incorporate your LLC. If you're going to be an out-of-state investor, I highly recommend that you definitely use an LLC. I believe that in general with any sort of investing, but with in-state investing, I give people a little bit of leeway with it. But if you're ever going to invest out of state, I want you to set up an LLC. Just because of that unknown. You aren't there all the time. You aren't extremely familiar with that industry in that state, in that city. You haven't been around it your entire life. You haven't been around it for even 5 years. So I highly recommend that when you incorporate your LLC, you're going to put it in the state that you are buying the property in. Now, there are some exceptions to this. Now, the exception would be if there are different tax ramifications, obviously across the different states. In a very broad broad conversation here, incorporating an LLC in California if you were purchasing there, which I don't know why you would right now, but in the event that you were purchasing in California right now, I wouldn't necessarily put your LLC in California just because you're going to have a lot of higher tax ramifications. I would probably put it then in the state that you're living in. If you're living in, Minnesota or Illinois, you're still going to be more advantageous incorporating in one of those states than you are in California. But you're definitely going to want to get an LLC set up. And then because you're setting up your LLC in a state that you don't reside in, you're going to need a registered agent. So a registered agent is someone who is willing to accept official mailings and service on your behalf, and it basically becomes the address of record for that corporation or that LLC. A registered agent can run relatively inexpensive, but they can also be expensive. So you can get a registered agent, which works out to about $200 a year, which is, not that much per month. But then they can easily go upwards of $600 or $700, depending where you live, depending on, what sort of services they're offering. But generally speaking, you can get a registered agent for pretty inexpensive. And then any of the mailings that you have for the properties, whether it be the tax bills or like violation notices, I would strongly recommend that you have it copied to the registered agent address. What the registered agent address or the registered agent is going to do, they're just basically going to scan that mail and then they're going to send it over to you and be like, FYI, we've received this. They're not going to actually do anything for you. They're not going to handle it, but they've received it and they're going to forward it to you and let you know that they've received it. Now, if you do hire a property manager, you could use the property manager as the address on file for the properties for billing, things like that. But I believe I said this in a very early on episode. I do not recommend putting all of your eggs in one basket. So if you have the opportunity with the municipality, there should be a secondary address that is copied, not just the property manager. If you have an LLC and a registered agent, make that secondary address the registered agent and have it set up so that they get notices of violations. They get notices of maybe delinquent water bills if the property manager is responsible for paying those. But you want to be sure and have that oversight. And the registered agent is a good way to have a little bit of that oversight without having your personal address out there. So I do recommend you set up an LLC for out-of-state investing and that you do use a registered agent, even if you are using a property manager. You don't have to use a registered agent, by the way. If you just want to use the property manager and then you just want to have stuff mailed to you, that's totally fine. But I do recommend that you set up an LLC, and I personally would use a registered agent if I were to go the route of investing out of state. Really, that's the long and short of it. When it comes down to out-of-state investing, all what's different is it's a matter of doing online networking versus doing in-person networking or sort of leveraging your local network. It's going to come down to getting referrals from people in that area of the state. It's going to come down to researching that state, that city, that county a little bit. It's going to come down to making 1 or 2 trips maybe out there per year. Just check out the area, check out the market, check out your properties. Remember that those trips are fully tax deductible. But it's really not that big of a deal. So would I invest out of state nowadays? Yeah, I think I would eventually. I don't know if I'm personally to that point yet, just because I feel like I have some good markets in my own state. But if I were living in, well, let's say California, where I don't feel there are necessarily any good markets right now, yeah, I would consider being an out-of-state investor. There really wouldn't be anything that would hold me back from doing that right now. It's all about building a network, leveraging that network, and building relationships that you trust. The sooner you start building those relationships and you start getting to know people, the more comfortable you are when you jump in and you find a deal. So start your networking soon. Start getting familiar with people, networking online, making friends out of fellow investors in the area, and just start building your network. Once you successfully build that network, it's going to take away a large amount of questions, uncertainty, apprehension about doing it, and you'll find yourself getting more comfortable with the idea of being an out-of-state investor. Now, of course, you don't have to do this. There's nothing There's nothing that says if you don't have opportunity markets in your state that you have to invest out of state. Obviously, you can, but you might not get the biggest bang for your buck. The reason they're not opportunity markets is likely a number of factors, but it probably comes down to there's different areas in the state that have better return, or better areas in the country that have better returns on equity down the road, or cash on cash return, or just they have better net incomes. So it's all a matter of what you're looking to do and what you feel comfortable with. But I wouldn't necessarily write off out of state investing simply because you don't physically live there. That is something that can definitely be overcome in today's world with the technology that we have. So this was I feel like it was a very brief introduction to this idea of out of state investing. I have a lot more ideas on this about how to make it work once we get past the idea of networking and buying your first property. So if you guys are interested in there being a part two to this, let's say in February sometime, let me know. Hit me up over on Anchor Podcasts, or over on Instagram at Landlord Chick, and let me know if you want part two of this, and we'll make it sort of post acquisition out of state investing. Because there's still a lot that we could talk about in regards to this, but this was a good primer episode as far as how you actually go about getting started in an out of state market. As always, I hope you guys have a great week, and I will see you next time.